Well, good morning and happy Good Friday. Thinking about Good Friday, first off, is why is it called Good Friday? There's a couple different reasons, but the main reason is because good's in the word for holy, kind of a holy Friday for those of us who call ourselves Christians or Christ followers. And thinking about Good Friday, I remember reading a story back in World War II early on. A couple of Nazis had captured a very elderly Jewish rabbi teacher, and they brought him down to the station, and in the same room where they were interrogating him, they were beating a young Jewish man to death. Instead of beating this Jewish rabbi to death, instead they began to take off his clothes, strip him naked, humiliation, and asked him to teach the message he was going to give on the Sabbath that weekend. And so he only asked for his yarmulke to wear, and they snarled at him and laughed at him, mocked him, and finally, of course, beat him and killed him. And you hear stories like that, and it just, for me, it just makes my blood boil, and it's just sickening. In many ways, that's exactly what happened to Jesus in this Holy Week, this Passion Week, this Good Friday. As we look at this today together, so difficult to envision the injustice, the shame that was endured by God's Son. Not exactly a good Friday for him. They flogged him, they spat upon him, they beat him, they mocked him, made fun of him. One of the things I think about is I think about the very self-restraint of God. How he just stood back and allowed it all to happen is incredible. In of itself, that's a miracle, if you ask me. Knowing that the Roman crucifixion where he was headed was actually the worst death you could receive, and by far it was revolting. As a matter of fact, the Roman citizens of the day would be beheaded for their crimes. Even the Jews preferred stoning over the crucifixion because the crucifixion was left for the worst of the worst, the criminals, the ones who tried to rape others, the ones who were trying to overthrow the government. And yet, when you hear about the story of Good Friday, one of the things that stands out to me too, in the midst of all of this pain, all of this suffering, all of this mocking, all of this beating, the blood, it's amazing to see Jesus still loving others, even on this day at the very end. He forgave the men who were doing this to him. He even took charge of taking care of his mother. He ministered to the sinner next to him, the thief on the cross next to him, led him to his kingdom in paradise. You know, another observation is that throughout this last day and hours of his life, he would cry out, Abba, Father, the intimacy that Jesus taught his followers to pray, our Father, our Daddy, our Abba. And yet, one of the phrases he uses here at the end of his life, hanging on a cross, is, my God, why have you forsaken me? It was this inconceivable split that opened up amongst the Godhead. The Son experienced an incredible abandonment from the Father, something he probably had never experienced before. C.S. Lewis said it this way. He said, the hiddenness of God perhaps presses most painfully on those who are in another way nearest to him, and therefore God himself, made man, will of all men be by God most forsaken. Talked about betrayal and forsakenness yesterday, but in that moment, the closest beings ever, Father, Son, somehow were not. And the reality is no theologian or pastor can adequately or fully explain the nature of what took place within the Trinity on Calvary. And all we know in some ways, in a simplistic way of understanding it, was a simple child who felt and experienced the forsakenness, the abandonment of his Father. We're never really told did the Father cry out. We're only kind of left to imagine. But ultimately all of this had to take place in order so that we might have everlasting life. Paul says it this way in Galatians, the Son became a curse for us I think it was in 1 Corinthians, he said, God made him who had no sin, sin for us. That day was anything but good, dark and sad. Skies were gray, tears by his mother and his followers and brothers. And despite all the shame, despite all of the sadness of it all, somehow what took place on Calvary became the most important single act in human history. Normally, when you think about a criminal's death, you think about failure, utter failure. But in this case, in God's kingdom, it led to victory. Victory over sin, and ultimately victory over death. It was so apparent that even one pagan Roman soldier cried out, it's recorded saying, surely, after Jesus passed, surely this was truly the Son of God. There were thieves on either side of him that showed really two possible responses. One mocked Jesus, a Messiah who couldn't even save himself. The other recognizing something very different about Jesus, and with the risk of a little bit of faith, asked Jesus to remember him when he comes into his kingdom. I love the response of Jesus. I tell you, from now on, you will be with me in paradise. Just that little bit of faith leads to everlasting life. And that's why it's called the good news. Just a little bit of faith can lead to everlasting life. The thief, some argue, maybe saw God's kingdom that day more clearly than anybody else. In essence, the two thieves pose a choice for all of humanity throughout all of history that we have to decide about Jesus. Is he who he says he is or not? I encourage us to look at the example of Jesus, of real power in weakness and restraint. The cross redefines God as one who is willing to relinquish his power for the sake of love, for the sake of others, for the sake of you and me. That's real power, by the way. Not in the world standard, whether it's politics, government, armies, military, race, status, money. Real power isn't holding on to power. Real power is letting go of the power that you have. The reality is, so much came to the point of conversions on Calvary. God renounced the one for the sake of the other. He put aside the powers and dominion of this world, the entrapment, and gave up that which he loved most, his son, in order that you and I might find everlasting life. That's why we have hope when it comes to Easter. For love does conquer all. Real power is the power of love. That's why Paul said the greatest of these is love. There really was a victory, though it seemed like utter defeat. Victory over sin and death. Maybe, just maybe, that's why it's called Good Friday. So how about you? Will you respond like the one thief, pushing God away, mocking him? Or will you respond like the other thief? Just a little bit of faith. Just a little bit of faith. For you will be with me forever in paradise. I'm glad I made that decision over 30 some odd years ago. Not that it hasn't come with its ups or its downs, its difficulties, but it's come with a lot of joys. It's come with a lot of, meeting me where I'm at in my needs. I'm thankful for God for that. Again, maybe that's why it's called Good Friday. Because even though it wasn't good for Jesus in that moment, it was what was good for all of humanity, the world and creation. I hope you have a good rest of your Friday. Looking forward to celebrating Easter. You can go to our website, efreebn.org. Join us live for the worship experience at 10:15 a.m. on this Sunday. You can go to YouTube, look up eFree Church, and you'll find us there. In the live experience, 10:15. You can also look it up through Facebook, eFree Church. Like us, share, and as we celebrate Easter together. Have a great rest of the day. Blessings.